If I asked you to describe the word faith, it's very likely that you would first look to the New Testament in order to find your answers. This is understandable, as many Christians are more familiar with the New Testament than the Old. Would you be surprised, though, if I told you that the theme of faith is also found in the Old Testament? We might not think so. We usually think that the Old Testament is reserved for judgment or wrath or law or things like that. Yet we're going to look at two examples of people, very different people in different times, who had faith in God in a very similar way that we do. First, we'll look at Abraham. He's called the father of our faith in Romans 4:4. And in Genesis 22, 1 through 8, he experiences a huge testing of his faith, where God, he asked Abraham to sacrifice his one and only promised son. Now this son, Isaac, had been promised to Abraham years ago by God, and God staked his very existence on this promise by saying that Abraham's line would be continued through his son Isaac. And yet in Genesis chapter 22, God commands Abraham to take his son to a mountain and sacrifice him as an offering to God. Now, what did Abraham do? Did he try to change God's plans to fit his own? Did he delay? Did he doubt God's character? No. The real test of Abraham's faith was whether or not he would trust in God as a person. Did he know God to be trustworthy, and did he know God to be loving? And the degree to which Abraham trusted God, God's character, was the amount of faith that Abraham showed. And so when Abraham went to the mountain and basically sacrificed his son, he proved to God that he had faith, and he proved to himself that he had faith. God, of course, knew. And so from the life of Abraham, we can clearly see the presence of a massive faith, and this is why he was called the father of our faith. Now, another example we can look at is from the life of David. David, the king, King David of Israel, he wrote quite a few psalms, and by looking at Psalm 27, we see a lot of language that reeks of faith in David's life. And there are words where God is putting David through some difficult times and trials, and David says that the Lord is my light and my salvation. David says, the Lord is the stronghold of my life. My heart is not afraid. I am confident. Now, while in the psalm, David doesn't at any point say, I have faith in God. But his language clearly shows that his faith is assumed. The very fact that he calls on God and asks for mercy, and the very fact that he says, my enemies will not overtake me, these are proof that he had a tremendous faith in God. And he didn't simply follow God's laws, but he knew God personally, to be able to say that the Lord is my light and my salvation. Obviously, he knew this God very, very well. And so it's clear from these two very Old Testament patriarchs that they experienced a great amount of faith. So what does this mean for us today? Well, just like Abraham and just like David, we can consider God to be trustworthy. And even in the midst of difficult times, like Abraham and like David, we can trust in the character and the nature of God, to take what we know, the experiences in our past, and to remember God's goodness and faithfulness in them. And when we're going through a difficult time, to remember the goodness of God when we're struggling. That is how we can have faith, just like the patriarchs.